Arizona Territory, summer of 1889. The trading post at Copper Ridge sat where the desert met the Red Rock Canyons, a place where desperate people came to trade what little they had left. On a scorching afternoon, a crowd gathered around a wooden platform, their eyes fixed on a figure that towered above them all. She stood 7 feet tall, her frame casting a shadow that swallowed 3 men at once, and when the bidding started at $1, the laughter echoed across the dusty square. But when a blind Apache scout stepped forward with a single coin in his scarred palm, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hammered down on Copper Ridge like a blacksmith working iron, relentless and without mercy. Heat rose from the packed earth in visible waves, distorting the horizon until the red cliffs in the distance seemed to shimmer and dance. The trading post sat at the intersection of 3 trails, each one carved by decades of wagon wheels and desperate feet. It was the kind of place where hope came to die quietly, where men traded their last possessions for one more week of survival, where the air tasted like dust and defeat. The platform had been erected that morning, hastily constructed from weathered planks salvaged from a collapsed barn. It stood 3 feet off the ground, reinforced with extra beams because today's auction required additional support. Word had spread through the territory for weeks. Something unusual was coming to Copper Ridge, something that would draw crowds from as far as 50 miles away. By noon, nearly 200 people had gathered, their faces burned dark by the sun, their clothes stiff with dried sweat and trail dirt. They came from ranches and mining camps, from failed homesteads and forgotten outposts. Some brought their families, children perched on shoulders to get a better view. Others came alone, bottles tucked into their coats, eyes already glazed with whiskey and curiosity. The atmosphere carried an electric quality, the kind that precedes a spectacle, a tragedy, or both. Men traded rumors in low voices, while women fanned themselves with folded newspapers, their expressions tight with judgment and fascination in equal measure. At the edge of the platform stood a man named Silas Grantham, the territorial auctioneer. He wore a black coat despite the heat, his shirt collar yellowed with age and stained at the edges. A silver watch chain hung across his vest, catching the light with each movement. His face was lean and angular, carved by years of making his living from other people's misfortunes. He'd sold livestock, land deeds, mining claims, and occasionally, when circumstances demanded it, human beings. He felt no particular shame about this. In the territories, commerce was commerce, and sentiment was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. Beside him stood a wooden crate serving as a makeshift podium, and on it rested a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and transactions that told the story of the frontier's darker commerce. A gavel lay next to it, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Silas picked it up, testing its weight in his palm, then set it down again. He was waiting, and so was the crowd. The murmur of voices grew louder as the afternoon stretched on. Men shifted their weight from foot to foot, wiping sweat from their faces with dirty bandanas. Someone started taking bets on what would happen, coins changing hands in the shade of a nearby wagon. A vendor moved through the crowd selling warm beer from a barrel, making decent money on other people's morbid curiosity. Children chased each other between the adults, their laughter sharp and out of place in the heavy atmosphere. Then, from the far end of the square, a wagon appeared. It moved slowly, pulled by 2 exhausted horses whose ribs showed through their dusty coats. The driver was a heavy-set man with a face like cured leather, his expression blank and businesslike. He didn't look at the crowd as he guided the wagon toward the platform. Behind him, in the wagon bed, something massive sat beneath a canvas tarp, the fabric stretched tight over an enormous form. The crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped running, every eye fixed on that covered shape as the wagon creaked to a halt beside the platform. The driver set the brake, climbed down without a word, and walked to the back of the wagon. He grabbed the edge of the tarp and paused, letting the moment stretch out, letting the anticipation build until it became almost unbearable. Then he pulled the tarp away. She sat on the wagon bed with her legs folded beneath her, her hands resting on her knees. Even seated, her head rose above the driver's. When she unfolded herself and stood, the collective intake of breath from the crowd sounded like wind rushing through a canyon. She was enormous, a living monument of muscle and bone and flesh that defied every natural proportion. 7 feet tall, perhaps more, with shoulders as broad as a doorframe and arms thick as fence posts. Her dress, crudely sewn from multiple bolts of rough fabric, hung on her like a tent, shapeless and functional. Designed not for beauty, but for basic coverage. Her face was angular and strong, with high cheekbones and a square jaw that might have been called handsome on a man. Her hair, dark brown and streaked with premature grey, had been pulled back severely and tied with a piece of twine. Her skin was weathered and sun-darkened, marked with old scars on her forearms and hands, the kind earned through hard labour and harder years. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, pale grey and startlingly clear, looking out at the crowd with neither fear nor defiance, only a kind of exhausted resignation. The driver gestured toward the platform. She climbed down from the wagon, and when her feet hit the ground, the impact sent a small puff of dust into the air. She moved with surprising grace for someone of her size, her steps measured and careful, as though she'd learned long ago to be conscious of her own enormity. The platform groaned under her weight as she stepped up onto it, the reinforced beams flexing but holding. She stood in the center, hands at her sides, and waited. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in a cacophony of shock, laughter, crude jokes, and nervous commentary. A woman near the front gasped and covered her mouth. A man shouted something vulgar that was immediately drowned out by laughter from his companions. Children pointed and stared, mouths open, until their mothers pulled their hands down and whispered sharp reprimands. But they all kept looking. They couldn't help it. Silas Grantham stepped forward, raising one hand for silence. It took several attempts before the crowd settled enough for him to speak. When he did, his voice carried the practiced projection of a man accustomed to making himself heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience on this fine afternoon." His tone was smooth, almost congenial, as though he were introducing a prize stallion rather than a human being. "Before you stands a most unusual offering. Her name, as recorded in my ledger, is Vera Colton. Age 28, origin, Nebraska Territory. Height 7 feet 2 inches as measured this morning. Weight, approximately 280 pounds. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. Someone in the crowd whistled, low and amazed. Silas continued, walking slowly around Vera as he spoke, his hands clasped behind his back like a professor delivering a lecture. Miss Colton has worked as a farmhand, a stable worker, and a freight loader. She can lift more than any 2 men combined. She can plow a field faster than a team of oxen. She requires no special provisions beyond basic food and shelter. She does not complain. She does not argue. And gentlemen, I can assure you she knows her place. Vera's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes remained fixed on some point beyond the crowd, as though she could see past the desert, past the territories, to some distant place where none of this was happening. "Now, I'll be honest with you," Silas said, stopping in front of her and turning back to the crowd. "Miss Colton is not what you'd call a conventional acquisition. She won't be winning any beauty contests. She won't be serving tea in your parlor or playing the piano for your guests. But if you need work done, if you need someone who can shoulder a burden that would break 3 ordinary people, well, you're looking at your answer." More laughter rippled through the crowd, but it had an edge to it now, uncomfortable and uncertain. A few men in the front had started to look at Vera, not with mockery, but with calculation, their minds already working through the practical applications of such strength. A mine foreman mentally tallied how much work she could do in his tunnels. A rancher considered what she might accomplish during branding season. A freight company owner wondered if she could replace his entire loading crew. Silas raised his hand again. Given the unusual nature of this offering, and in the interest of moving things along, we'll start the bidding at $1. Do I hear $1? The crowd fell silent. The question hung in the air like smoke. $1 for a human being. The insult of it was so profound that even the most callous men in attendance seemed to feel its weight. It was less than the price of a meal, less than a night's lodging, less than a worn-out saddle or a lame horse. It was the price of nothing, or worse than nothing. Vera's hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, slowly curled into fists. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it carried the weight of every humiliation she'd endured, every year of being treated as a curiosity, a freak, a thing to be pitied or exploited or sold. Her breathing remained steady, but her nostrils flared slightly, the only outward sign of the storm contained within her towering frame. "Come now," Silas cajoled, his voice taking on a playful tone. "Surely one of you gentlemen can spare a single dollar for the strongest worker you'll ever employ. Think of it as an investment. $1 today, hundreds of dollars in labor tomorrow." A man near the back shouted, "She'll eat you out of house and home. Probably costs $5 a day just to feed her." Laughter erupted again, louder this time, fueled by the summer heat and the cruelty that grows in crowds like weeds in untended soil. "Maybe she's part bear," another voice called out. "Better chain her up before she goes into hibernation. Or part mountain. Ever try to move a mountain, Silas? That's what you're selling." The jokes built on each other, each man trying to outdo the last, the crowd feeding on its own mockery. Vera stood through it all, her face a mask of stone, her eyes distant. She'd heard it before, all of it, in every town from Nebraska to Arizona. The words changed slightly, but the meaning was always the same. You are not one of us, you are other, you are wrong. Silas let it go on for another minute, then raised his hand again. "Entertaining as this is, gentlemen, we do have a schedule to keep. $1. Final call. Do I hear $1 or do we move on?" The silence that followed was different from before. It was the silence of shame, of a crowd realizing it had gone too far, that its cruelty had crossed from entertainment into something darker. A few men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their boots. Women turned away, unable to meet Vera's distant gaze. Children sensed the change in atmosphere and pressed closer to their parents. Silas frowned, his showmanship faltering for the first time. He'd miscalculated. He'd thought someone would bite, if only out of practical self-interest. But he'd humiliated her too thoroughly, reduced her too completely. No man wanted to be seen bidding on something the entire crowd had just finished mocking. It would make him look foolish, desperate, or cruel. He was about to declare the auction closed, to cut his losses and move Vera along to the next town. When the crowd began to part, at first it was just a ripple of movement near the back, people stepping aside without quite knowing why. Then the ripple became a path, and through that path walked a man unlike any other in the gathering. He was Apache, that much was immediately clear from his features and bearing. His skin was the color of burnished copper, weathered by decades under the desert sun. He wore his hair long, black streaked with gray, tied back with a strip of leather. His clothing was a mixture of traditional and practical. A cotton shirt, worn but clean, buckskin leggings and moccasins that made no sound as he walked. He carried a walking stick, carved from dark wood and polished smooth by years of use, which he swept slowly back and forth in front of him with each step. His eyes were open, but they were pale and clouded, the pupils barely visible beneath a milky film. He was blind, completely and obviously blind. Yet he moved through the crowd with absolute confidence, his stick finding obstacles before his feet, his head turning slightly at the sound of voices and breathing. People scrambled to get out of his way, some out of respect, others out of simple uncertainty about how to interact with him. Behind him, at a respectful distance, walked a younger Apache man, perhaps 30 years old, who watched the older man's progress with protective attentiveness, but didn't offer help. The younger man's face was solemn, his eyes sweeping the crowd with barely concealed contempt. The blind man reached the front of the platform and stopped. He stood there for a long moment, his head tilted slightly upward, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Then, without turning to the younger man behind him, without asking for confirmation or assistance, he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a single coin. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, where it caught the sunlight and gleamed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. $1, he said. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily across the suddenly silent square. His English was flawless, touched with only the barest trace of an accent. I offer $1. Silas Grantham stared at him, his face a mixture of surprise and calculation. The crowd remained frozen, unsure how to react. A blind Apache bidding on a giant white woman? It was so unexpected, so far outside the normal order of things, that it short-circuited the mockery that had been flowing so freely moments before. You understand what you're bidding on? Silas asked, his showman's patter temporarily deserting him. The blind man's expression didn't change. I understand perfectly. $1 for Vera Colton. You can't even see her, someone in the crowd muttered, loud enough to carry. The blind man's head turned slightly in the direction of the voice. I have no need to see her with eyes. I hear her breathing. I hear her heart. I hear the wood of the platform groaning beneath her weight. I hear all of you, small men with small hearts, making yourselves smaller with your cruelty. $1 is more than any of you were willing to offer, which makes me the highest bidder. Or am I mistaken about how auctions work? A flush crept up Silas's neck. He glanced at the crowd, searching for another bid, but found only averted eyes and shuffling feet. The stranger had shamed them all with a few sentences, and they knew it. Very well, Silas said stiffly. He opened his ledger and picked up a pen. Name? Thomas Nakani. Scout retired. I live in the foothills east of here, where the canyon meets the valley. Silas wrote this down, his pen scratching across the paper. And you understand that this is a binding contract, that you're taking full responsibility for Miss Colton, her care, her conduct, everything? I understand the laws of your people, Thomas said quietly. I understand them better than you might think. Silas slid the ledger forward, then realized his mistake. He cleared his throat. You'll need to make your mark. Or perhaps your companion can sign for you. I can sign my own name, Thomas said. He held out his free hand. The pen! Silas handed it to him, and Thomas set his walking stick against his leg, freeing both hands. The younger Apache man stepped forward, gently guided Thomas's hand to the ledger, and whispered something in their language. Thomas nodded, and then, to the amazement of everyone watching, he signed his name in clear, precise script. The letters were perfectly formed, aligned, legible. He'd learned to write before he'd lost his sight, and he hadn't forgotten. He handed the pen back, picked up his walking stick, and dropped the dollar coin into Silas's palm. The metallic clink was the only sound in the entire square. Silas pocketed the coin and made a notation in his ledger. She's yours, then. Miss Colton, you're now legally bound to Thomas Nakani. Step down from the platform. For the first time since the auction began, Vera moved. She turned her head slowly, looking down at Thomas. He couldn't see her, but he seemed to sense her regard. He turned his face up toward hers, and something passed between them. Some wordless communication that existed beyond sight, beyond speech. Vera stepped down from the platform. The wood groaned in relief. She stood beside Thomas, towering over him by more than 2 feet. The contrast was almost comical. He was perhaps 5'8", lean and compact, while she was a living colossus. Yet somehow, standing together, they didn't look absurd. They looked like two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, in the most unlikely of places. Thomas reached out slowly with one hand, palm open, offering rather than demanding. Vera looked at it for a long moment, then slowly extended her own hand. His fingers, calloused and scarred, wrapped around hers. They were so small compared to her massive hands that his grip seemed like a child's, but there was strength in it, certainty. We're leaving now, Thomas said, not to Vera, but to the crowd. We're going home, and none of you will follow. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with quiet authority. The younger Apache man stepped to Thomas's other side, his hand resting casually on the knife at his belt, his message equally clear. The crowd parted again, creating a wide corridor. Thomas turned, Vera's hand still in his, and began to walk. She followed, her steps measured to match his slower pace. The younger Apache man fell in behind them, walking backward for several steps, his eyes on the crowd, daring anyone to move. No one did. They stood in silence and watched as the blind Apache, the giant woman and their guardian, disappeared down the trail that led east toward the foothills. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the red rocks in shades of orange and gold. Dust rose behind them, golden in the slanting light, and then they were gone, swallowed by the vastness of the desert. On the platform, Silas Grantham closed his ledger with a snap. He looked at the crowd, which was beginning to disperse now, people drifting away in twos and threes, their voices subdued. Their earlier cruelty transformed into something else, something they didn't want to examine too closely. He counted the dollar in his pocket, the smallest commission he'd ever earned, and wondered if he'd just witnessed something remarkable or something terrible. Perhaps, he thought as he packed up his things, it was both. Perhaps that was the nature of the frontier itself, where every transaction carried the weight of salvation and damnation in equal measure, where $1 could purchase shame or possibility, and where sometimes, against all odds and reason, two broken people found each other in the dust. The platform stood empty now, abandoned until the next auction, the next transaction, the next moment when someone's worth would be measured in coins and mockery. But for Vera Colton and Thomas Nakani, that platform was already behind them, receding into memory, becoming part of a story that was only just beginning. The trail leading away from Copper Ridge narrowed quickly, transforming from a packed wagon road into little more than a deer path, winding through scrub brush and scattered juniper. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, turning the air thick and shimmering. Heat radiated from the red rocks on either side of the path, creating waves that distorted the landscape into something dreamlike and uncertain. Thomas Nakani walked with steady purpose, his stick sweeping the ground ahead in practiced arcs. His pace was unhurried but confident, each step placed with the precision of someone who had walked this route countless times. Vera followed 3 paces behind, her shadow stretching long across the trail, engulfing Thomas entirely. She watched his back, the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the rhythm of his walking stick against stone and earth. She said nothing. Neither did he. Behind them both, the younger Apache man kept watch, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. His name was Daniel Nashoba, Thomas's nephew, and he moved like smoke through the brush, barely disturbing the landscape. Every few minutes, he would glance back toward Copper Ridge, ensuring they weren't being followed, then return his attention to the trail ahead. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crunch of footsteps, the whisper of wind through sage, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but it was heavy with unspoken things, with questions neither party knew how to ask. With the weight of what had just transpired in that dusty square, after nearly an hour of walking, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling terrain, then to steeper inclines, where red rock formations rose like ancient sentinels. The path climbed steadily upward, winding between boulders and around outcroppings of stone that looked as though they'd been there since the world was young. Juniper and pinyon pine became more frequent, offering patches of shade that felt like blessings. Vera's breathing remained steady, despite the climb and the heat. She was accustomed to hard work, to long hours of physical labor that would break most men. Her size, which had been a curse in so many ways, had at least granted her strength and endurance. Sweat soaked through her rough dress, darkening the fabric, but she didn't slow, didn't ask for rest. Thomas, however, did stop. He raised one hand, and both Vera and Daniel halted immediately. Thomas tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear. Then he stepped off the main path toward a cluster of rocks where a spring bubbled up from between stones, creating a small pool before trickling away into the thirsty earth. "Water," Thomas said simply. He knelt beside the pool, set down his walking stick, and cupped his hands to drink. Daniel did the same, then stepped back, gesturing toward the spring. Thomas turned his head in Vera's direction. "Drink, it's clean." "The next water is 2 hours ahead." Vera hesitated. She'd learned caution over the years, learned not to trust gestures that seemed kind, learned that generosity often came with hidden costs. But thirst won out over suspicion. She knelt beside the spring, the rocks groaning slightly under her weight, and drank deeply. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of stone and minerals, the best thing she'd tasted in months. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at Thomas. He had retrieved his walking stick and now stood facing the direction they'd come from, his clouded eyes seeing nothing but his attention focused entirely on listening. "No one followed," Daniel said quietly in English, clearly for Vera's benefit. Thomas nodded. "They won't. They're ashamed, and shame makes even brave men." Vera studied him openly now, knowing he couldn't see her stare. His face was lined deeply, particularly around his eyes and mouth, the kind of lines carved by decades of weather and hardship. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, old and faded, but still visible. His hands, resting on his walking stick, were strong despite his age, the knuckles prominent, the fingers long and capable. "How long have you been blind?" The question escaped Vera's lips before she could stop it. Her voice was rough from disuse, deeper than most women's, with a flat prairie accent that marked her origins. Thomas turned toward her voice, his expression unchanging. 12 years. A mining accident in the silver camps near Prescott. Dynamite charge went off wrong. Took my eyes and most of my hearing in the left ear. Left me do everything else. "I'm sorry," Vera said, because it seemed like the thing to say. "Don't be. I see more now than I did before." He said it without irony or bitterness, as a simple fact. "We should keep moving. The climb gets harder ahead." He was right. The path grew steeper, switching back and forth across the face of a ridge that rose dramatically from the desert floor. The vegetation thickened, pine trees growing taller and more numerous. The air cooled as they gained elevation, and the quality of light changed, becoming softer, filtered through branches and needles. Vera marveled at how Thomas navigated the terrain. His stick found every obstacle, every change in elevation, every loose stone. When the path narrowed to barely 2 feet wide, with a drop-off on one side, he walked along it as confidently as if it were a city sidewalk. Daniel stayed close, but never interfered, trusting his uncle's abilities completely. They passed through a stand of ponderosa pine, their trunks massive and ancient, their bark smelling of vanilla in the afternoon heat. Somewhere in the distance, water tumbled over rocks, a constant rushing sound that grew gradually louder as they walked. The path descended briefly into a small canyon, where a creek ran swift and clear over smooth stones. Thomas stopped at the creek's edge. "We cross here. The stones are slippery. Daniel will help you." But before Daniel could move, Vera said, "I can manage." She studied the creek, measuring the distance between stones, calculating her steps. Then she moved, surprisingly graceful despite her size, placing her feet carefully on the larger rocks. The stones shifted under her weight but held. In 6 strides she was across, barely dampening the hem of her dress. Thomas smiled, a brief expression that transformed his weathered face. "Good balance for someone so tall." "Had to learn it early," Vera said. "World's not built for people like me." "No," Thomas agreed, crossing the creek himself with Daniel's light hand at his elbow. "It's built for people who fit easily into boxes. The rest of us have to make our own way." They climbed out of the canyon, following the creek upstream for a while before the path diverged, leading them away from the water and deeper into the forested foothills. The sun was sinking lower now, its light turning golden and warm, casting long shadows through the trees. Birds called evening songs, and somewhere in the underbrush, small creatures rustled through fallen needles. The path crested a final rise, and suddenly the landscape opened before them. They stood at the edge of a bowl-shaped valley, perhaps a mile across, ringed by pine-covered hills. A meadow filled the valley floor, tall grass swaying in the breeze. At the far end, where the valley narrowed, a cabin sat against the hillside. It was built from dark logs, weathered silver-grey by sun and time. The structure was simple but solid, with a stone chimney rising from one side and a covered porch running along the front. Behind it stood a small barn, also log-built, and beyond that a corral enclosed by split-rail fencing. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, suggesting a fire banked but still alive. "Home," Thomas said simply. He started down the path into the valley, his stick tapping against stone, then earth, then grass. Vera followed, her eyes taking in every detail. The valley felt hidden, protected, a secret place carved out of the wilderness. The meadow grass came up to her knees, and it whispered against her dress as she walked. Wildflowers dotted the field, purple and yellow and white, their petals closing as evening approached. As they neared the cabin, a dog emerged from beneath the porch, a medium-sized mixed breed with a graying muzzle and intelligent eyes. It trotted directly to Thomas, who reached down to scratch behind its ears without breaking stride. "This is Scout," Thomas said. "He's older than he looks and smarter than most people." The dog regarded Vera with calm interest, no fear or aggression, then turned its attention to Daniel, receiving another scratch before returning to its spot beneath the porch. Thomas climbed the 3 steps to the porch, which creaked under his weight but held firm. He pushed open the door, which wasn't locked, and stepped inside. Vera hesitated at the threshold, old instincts flaring. But Daniel gestured for her to enter, and after a moment, she ducked her head and stepped through. The interior was a single large room, clean and organized with the precision of someone who couldn't afford clutter or chaos. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire burning in it, casting flickering light across the space. A bed sat in one corner, neatly made with wool blankets. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, handmade but sturdy. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies, tools, and personal items arranged in careful order. A cook's stove stood near the fireplace, and beside it a basin for washing. But what struck Vera most was the space itself. The ceiling was high, much higher than necessary for a man of Thomas's height. The doorways were tall and wide. Even the bed frame sat elevated on extra supports. It was as though the cabin had been built with someone much larger in mind. Thomas moved through the space with absolute familiarity, crossing to the stove, adding wood to the fire, checking the water in the basin. His movements were efficient and practiced, requiring no sight whatsoever. "There's a room," Thomas said, gesturing toward a door Vera hadn't noticed, partially hidden behind a hanging blanket. "Built it last year. Has a bed, a chest, and a window." "It's yours." Vera stared at the door, then at Thomas. "You built it last year?" "Yes, before you knew I existed. Before I knew your name," Thomas corrected. "But I knew you existed, or someone like you. Someone who needed a place. Someone who needed space to breathe without hitting their head on the world." Vera crossed slowly to the door and pushed it open. The room beyond was small but private, with a bed that looked like it had been constructed from multiple regular bed frames, joined together and reinforced. A chest sat at the foot of it, and a window looked out over the valley, now glowing with the colors of sunset. A handmade rug covered the floor, and an oil lamp sat on a small table beside the bed. She turned back to Thomas, who stood in the main room, his face turned in her direction. "I don't understand. Why would you do this? Why would you bid on me? Why would you bring me here?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to one of the shelves and ran his fingers along it until they found what he sought. He pulled down a small object and held it out toward her. Daniel, seeing his uncle's gesture, said quietly, "It's a carving. You should look at it." Vera crossed back into the main room and took the object from Thomas's hand. It was carved from dark wood, polished smooth, no larger than her palm. It depicted a mountain, stylized and abstract, with strong vertical lines suggesting strength and permanence. "I carved that 2 years ago," Thomas said. "During winter, the snow trapped me inside for weeks. I kept thinking about something my grandfather told me when I was young. He said that some people are born to be rivers, moving and changing, never still. And some are born to be mountains, standing firm no matter what storms come. He said mountains don't apologize for taking up space. They don't make themselves smaller to comfort the valleys. They simply are, and the world adjusts to them, or it doesn't." He paused, his hands resting on his walking stick. "He told me I was a mountain, even though I was small in body. He said I'd understand someday. And I did, after I lost my sight, after the world expected me to disappear, to become less. I understood that being a mountain isn't about size. It's about refusing to be eroded by the cruelty of others." Vera looked at the carving, her large hands cradling it gently. Her throat tightened. "When I heard about you," Thomas continued, "heard the rumors traveling through the territories about a woman so tall she couldn't find a place to fit, I thought, there is another mountain, and mountains should not stand alone." The room fell silent, except for the crackle of fire and the evening wind moving through the pines outside. Vera's hands trembled slightly, the carving smooth and warm against her palm. Finally, she found her voice. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to accept kindness. Every time someone's been kind, they wanted something in return. Then it wasn't kindness," Thomas said simply. "It was a transaction. Kindness expects nothing. It simply is." He turned and moved toward the stove. "There's stew from yesterday. I'll warm it. You should rest. Tomorrow we'll talk more. Tonight, you just need to know you're safe." Daniel, who had been standing quietly by the door, nodded to Vera and slipped outside, presumably to tend to the evening chores. Scout followed him, the dog's nails clicking on the wooden floor. Vera stood in the center of the room, still holding the carved mountain, watching as Thomas moved about the cabin with practiced ease. She looked down at the carving again, at the strong lines suggesting permanence and strength. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something other than resignation. She felt the possibility. Outside, the last light faded from the valley, and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The cabin settled into evening quiet, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, steady line. And inside, a giant woman who had been sold for $1 stood in a room built high enough for her to stand straight, holding a wooden mountain in her hands, and allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, against all odds, she had finally found a place where she could stop making herself small. The fire crackled. Water boiled, and in the gathering darkness of the Arizona wilderness, two unlikely people shared their first evening in the same space, not yet knowing each other's stories, not yet understanding the connection that had brought them together, but beginning, slowly, to believe that perhaps neither of them had to face the world alone anymore. Morning arrived in the valley, with mist clinging to the meadow grass like something alive and breathing. Vera woke to birdsong and the unfamiliar comfort of a bed that didn't force her to curl into an unnatural shape. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the absence of pain in her back and legs, by the softness of the mattress beneath her, by the simple fact that her feet didn't hang off the end of the bed frame. Through the window, pale light filtered through pine branches, painting patterns across the wooden floor. She could hear movement in the main room, quiet and methodical. The sound of someone who'd long ago learned to move through the world without disrupting it. She rose slowly, her joints protesting slightly from yesterday's long walk. Her dress, the only garment she owned, was wrinkled and stained with trail dust. She smoothed it as best she could, then opened the door and stepped into the main room. Thomas stood at the basin, washing his face with careful, practiced movements. He'd already dressed for the day in clean clothes, his long hair freshly braided. He didn't turn when she entered, but he spoke as though he'd known the exact moment she'd emerged from her room. "There's coffee in the pot. Cups are on the second shelf, left side. The morning bread is cooling on the table." Vera crossed to the shelf, her fingers finding the cups exactly where he'd said. They were simple clay mugs, handmade, slightly irregular but functional. She poured coffee, the aroma rich and dark, unlike anything she'd had in months. Most of the places she'd worked gave their laborers chicory water and called it coffee. This was the real thing, strong enough to chase away the morning chill. She took a piece of the bread from the table. It was dense and hearty, still warm, with a crust that crackled when she broke it. The taste was simple, but good, made with care rather than haste. Thomas finished at the basin and dried his face on a towel hanging from a hook. Daniel will be back this afternoon. He's gone to check the trap lines in the upper canyon. It'll be just us today. Vera nodded, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. All right. Thomas moved to the table and sat in one of the chairs. Sit, please. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the other chair. It creaked under her weight, but held. Everything in this cabin seemed built to accommodate her size, and the strangeness of that fact hadn't diminished with sleep. For several minutes they ate in silence. Thomas broke his bread into small pieces, eating slowly and deliberately. Vera watched him, noting how his fingers moved across the table surface, creating a mental map of where everything sat. He never fumbled, never knocked anything over. His blindness was simply part of how he moved through the world, not a limitation, but a different way of seeing. You have questions, Thomas said finally, setting down his coffee cup. I can hear them in the way you breathe. Ask. Vera wrapped her hands around her own cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. Why did you really buy me? And don't tell me it's because of what your grandfather said about mountains. There's more to it than that. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Then he leaned back in his chair, his clouded eyes directed somewhere past her shoulder, and began to speak. 20 years ago, I wasn't blind. I worked as a scout for the army, guiding expeditions through Apache territory. I was good at it. I could track anything, read signs in the earth that other men missed. I knew every water source, every pass, every place where you could hide or make a stand. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. There was a winter expedition. The officer in charge was arrogant, refused to listen to warnings about the weather. We got caught in a blizzard in the high country, lost half the unit to exposure and frostbite. I tried to lead them to shelter, but the officer overruled me, said we'd push through. By the time he admitted his mistake, it was too late. Vera listened without interrupting, sensing that this was a story Thomas rarely told. We made it to a canyon where there was some protection from the wind. Set up camp, tried to wait out the storm, but it lasted 3 days, and our supplies ran out. Men started dying. The officer himself froze in his sleep on the second night. I was in command by default, but I couldn't see more than 5 feet through the snow. I couldn't find the way out. He lifted his coffee cup, took a slow sip, then continued. On the morning of the 4th day, someone appeared at the edge of our camp. I thought I was hallucinating. It was a woman alone, wearing furs and carrying a walking staff taller than she was. She didn't speak English well, just a few words, but she made us understand she would lead us to safety. Thomas's expression softened at the memory. She was Navajo, we learned later. Her name was Ayasha, and she was enormous, taller than any woman I'd ever seen, taller than most men. She moved through that blizzard like she was part of the storm itself. Like the snow made way for her. Vera's grip tightened on her cup. She led us for 6 hours through terrain I would never have attempted in those conditions. She broke trail, carried the men who couldn't walk anymore, found us shelter in a cave system I'd passed a dozen times without knowing existed. She built fires, rationed out food from her own supplies, kept us alive until the storm broke. He set his cup down carefully on the table. When we made it back to the fort, the new commanding officer wanted to reward her. Offered her money, supplies, whatever she wanted. She refused everything, said she didn't do it for reward, said her mother taught her that those with strength have a duty to shelter those who are weak, and that refusing to help when you have the ability is the same as murder. Thomas's voice dropped lower. The soldiers mocked her after she left. Called her a freak, said she wasn't natural, made jokes about her size. They were alive because of her, and still they found ways to diminish her. I never forgot that. Never forgot the way she stood there listening to their laughter, her face showing nothing. Before she turned and walked back into the wilderness alone, he reached across the table, his hand extended, palm up. After a moment's hesitation, Vera placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. I looked for her afterward. Spent months trying to track her down, to thank her properly. But she'd disappeared. No one knew where she'd gone. Then I had my accident, lost my sight, and I couldn't search anymore. But I never stopped thinking about her, about how the world treated her, about how she saved us and received nothing but cruelty in return. He squeezed her hand gently. When I heard about you, about a woman being auctioned like livestock because her body didn't fit into the narrow spaces the world carved out for her, I heard Ayasha's story repeating. I couldn't save her. I couldn't even thank her. But I could do this. I could offer you what she should have been offered, a place where your size is not a burden, where you don't have to make yourself smaller to make others comfortable. Vera's eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears fall. I'm not the woman who saved you. No, Thomas agreed. You're your own person with your own story, but you deserve the same dignity she deserved and never received. That's not about repaying a debt. That's about being the kind of person who doesn't make the same mistakes twice. He released her hand and stood, moving to the shelf where he'd retrieved the carved mountain the night before. His fingers traced along the wood until they found another object. He brought it back to the table and set it down in front of Vera. It was a pouch made of soft leather, worn smooth with age, with intricate beadwork in geometric patterns across its surface. The beads were turquoise and white, arranged in designs that spoke of careful craftsmanship and cultural knowledge. Ayasha dropped this during the rescue, Thomas said. I found it after the storm, tried to return it, but I could never find her. I've kept it all these years. I want you to have it. Vera stared at the pouch, her large hands hovering over it but not touching. I can't. This belongs to someone else. It belongs to someone who saved lives and was never properly honored for it. Someone who was made to feel like her existence was a problem to be solved, rather than a strength to be celebrated. If I can't give it back to her, then it should go to someone who understands what she faced. Slowly, Vera picked up the pouch. It was lighter than she expected, the leather supple despite its age. She opened it carefully and found inside a collection of small items, a carved bone needle, several sinew threads, a small piece of turquoise, and a folded piece of cloth. She unfolded the cloth and found herself looking at a simple drawing done in charcoal. It depicted a woman standing on a mountain peak, her arms raised to the sky, her size emphasized by the tiny trees at her feet. The drawing was crude but powerful, conveying strength and freedom in equal measure. She drew that herself, Thomas said quietly. At least I assume she did. It was in the pouch when I found it. Vera traced the outline of the figure with one finger, her touch feather-light. The woman in the drawing stood without shame, without attempting to diminish herself, claiming her space in the world with absolute conviction. Something inside Vera's chest cracked open. A fissure in the armor she'd built over years of rejection and ridicule. She carefully folded the cloth and placed it back in the pouch, then held the pouch against her chest. Thank you, she whispered, for telling me. For showing me this, Thomas nodded. There's more I want to show you, but it requires a walk. Are you strong enough after yesterday? I'm always strong enough, Vera said, and for the first time it didn't sound like a burden. They left the cabin together, Thomas with his walking stick and Vera beside him, Scout trotting ahead. The morning mist had burned away, revealing the valley in full daylight. The meadow grass sparkled with dew, and the surrounding hills rose green and solid against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Thomas led them along a path that wound through the meadow toward the northern edge of the valley. They walked in comfortable silence. The only sounds were their footsteps and the whisper of grass and wind. After 20 minutes, they reached a grove of aspen trees, their white bark marked with old scars and carvings. Thomas stopped at the base of the largest tree. Put your hand on the trunk, Vera did as instructed, her palm pressing against the smooth bark. The tree was massive, easily 4 feet in diameter, its branches spreading wide overhead. "This tree is over 200 years old," Thomas said. "It was here before the Spanish came, before the Americans, before any of the borders that people draw across the land. It's watched generations come and go. It survived drought and fire and every storm the sky could throw at it." He placed his own hand on the trunk beside hers. "And do you know how it survived? By growing tall, by refusing to be small, by reaching up toward the light instead of folding in on itself." Vera looked up into the branches, watching them sway gently in the breeze. "The world will always tell you to be smaller," Thomas continued. "It's uncomfortable with anything that doesn't fit into its pre-built boxes. But the things that last, the things that matter, are the ones that refuse to shrink. Mountains don't apologize. Rivers don't ask permission. Trees don't bend themselves into shapes that make others comfortable." He turned his face toward her, his clouded eyes unseeing, but somehow still penetrating. "You've spent your whole life being told you're too much. Too tall, too strong, too different. But you're not too much. You're exactly enough. And anyone who can't see that is looking at the world through a keyhole and calling it a window." Vera's throat closed. She pressed her forehead against the bark of the ancient tree, feeling its solidity, its permanence. For years, she'd thought her size was a curse, a cosmic joke played at her expense. But standing here, her hand on this tree that had refused to be anything other than what it was, she felt the first stirring of something different. Not pride, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of pride. The seed of it planted in soil that had been barren for too long. They stayed there for a long time. 2 people and an ancient tree, connected by touch and silence, and the understanding that survival sometimes means refusing to disappear. When they finally walked back to the cabin, the sun was high overhead, warming the valley. Thomas moved toward the woodpile to split logs for the evening fire, but Vera stepped forward. "Let me," she said. Thomas tilted his head questioningly. "You said I'm strong enough. Let me be strong enough for something good." Thomas smiled, stepped back and gestured toward the axe, leaning against the cabin wall. "It's yours." Vera picked up the axe. In her hands, it felt perfectly balanced, an extension of her body rather than a tool she had to fight with. She positioned a log on the chopping block, raised the axe, and brought it down with controlled power. The log split cleanly in 2, again and again. And again. She worked for an hour, her movements steady and rhythmic, her breathing controlled. The pile of split wood grew. Sweat soaked through her dress, but she didn't stop. There was something cleansing in the work, something that felt like reclamation. Thomas sat on the porch steps, listening to the sound of the axe striking wood, and he smiled. Scout lay beside him, content. When Vera finally set down the axe, she'd split enough wood to last a week. She turned to find Thomas still sitting there, his face turned toward the sun. "Feel better?" he asked. "Yes," Vera said, and meant it. That evening they shared another simple meal. But this time, the silence between them was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers trying to measure each other. It was the silence of 2 people beginning to understand that they spoke the same language. Even when no words were said, and in the leather pouch that now hung from a peg beside Vera's bed, a charcoal drawing of a woman on a mountain peak waited, a reminder that she was not the first to walk this path, and that somewhere in the vast territories of the West, another woman had once stood tall and refused to bend. 3 weeks passed in the valley, each day bleeding into the next, with a rhythm Vera had never known before. She woke to birdsong, worked alongside Thomas and Daniel on tasks that needed doing, ate meals that filled her belly, and slept in a bed that fit her body. The constant tension she'd carried for years began to loosen, like a fist slowly unclenching. But Thomas remained an enigma. He was kind without being intrusive, present without being demanding. He taught her the layout of the valley, the location of every spring and game trail, the names of plants that could heal and those that could harm. Yet he never asked about her past, Never pressed for the story she knew he must be curious about, it was Daniel who finally broke the unspoken agreement to leave the past unexamined. They were working together in the garden behind the cabin, pulling weeds from between rows of squash and beans. The afternoon sun hung heavy overhead, and Vera had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth to keep it from sticking to her neck. Daniel worked a few rows over, his movements efficient and practiced. "He's been waiting for you a long time," Daniel said suddenly, his voice carrying across the garden rows. Vera's hands stilled in the soil. "What do you mean?" Daniel sat back on his heels, wiping dirt from his palms onto his pants. "My uncle. He's been preparing for someone to come, building that room, making the doorways higher, carving those things he keeps on the shelf. For 2 years, maybe more, he's been getting ready. He told me about the woman who saved him," Vera said carefully. "Ayasha, he said he was honoring her memory." "That's part of it," Daniel agreed. "But there's more he hasn't told you. More he probably won't tell you unless you ask directly, because he's stubborn about not forcing his stories on people." Vera turned to face him fully. "Then why are you telling me?" Daniel's expression was serious, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Because I think you need to know. Because I think maybe you already know, somewhere deep, but you're afraid to examine it too closely. I don't understand." Daniel stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and gestured for her to follow him. They walked away from the garden, past the barn where Thomas was inside mending tack, and up a small rise that overlooked the valley. Daniel stopped at the crest and pointed toward the western hills. "See that gap between the two peaks? The one that looks like a notch cut from the ridgeline?" Vera nodded, shading her eyes against the sun. "That's Devil's Passage. Narrow canyon, treacherous in winter, usually avoided by anyone with sense. About 15 years ago, a freight wagon tried to make it through during an early snow. Driver lost control. Wagon went over the edge, dropped maybe 200 feet into the rocks below." Vera's stomach tightened, though she didn't know why. "Driver died on impact," Daniel continued, his voice neutral but heavy with meaning. "But there was a passenger, a girl, maybe 13 years old, traveling alone. She survived the fall, but her legs were crushed, pinned under the wagon wreckage. She should have died there, would have died if someone hadn't heard the crash." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Vera reached out to steady herself against a nearby pine, her palm pressing into rough bark. "Thomas was hunting in those hills," Daniel said. "Heard the wagon go over, went to investigate, found the girl trapped, freezing, in shock. He couldn't move the wagon by himself, couldn't free her legs. So he stayed with her, built a fire, shared his food, kept her warm and conscious while he waited for help." Daniel turned to look at Vera directly now. He sent his hunting partner back to get men and equipment. It took 2 days. 2 days of Thomas sitting in that canyon, talking to that girl, keeping her alive through pain and cold and fear. He told her stories, sang songs, made her promise to hold on. Vera's legs felt weak. She lowered herself to the ground, sitting heavily on the hillside, her eyes fixed on the distant gap between peaks. When help finally came, they managed to free her. Carried her down the mountain on a stretcher. Thomas rode with them to the doctor in Prescott, stayed until he knew she'd survive. Her legs healed mostly, though she walked with a limp for years after. Daniel crouched beside Vera, his voice dropping lower. The girl's name was Vera Colton, 13 years old, already nearly 6 feet tall, traveling alone because her father had died and her mother's family back in Nebraska didn't want a girl who'd grown too big to be proper. She was being sent to work as a housemaid for a distant cousin who needed cheap labor. Vera's hands dug into the earth, her fingers curling around grass and soil. Memories crashed through her mind, fractured and incomplete, cold, pain. A voice in the darkness, steady and calm, telling her stories about coyotes and stars and mountains that touched the sky, ends that built fires and shared warmth and never once complained about the weight. "I don't remember his face," she whispered. "I remember the voice, remember someone staying with me, but I was in so much pain everything was blurred." When I woke up in the doctor's office, they said a scout had saved me, but he'd already left. I never knew his name. He left because he had to, Daniel said. His unit was moving out, and he'd already delayed them by 2 days. But he made the doctor promise to make sure you were placed somewhere safe, gave him money from his own pay to cover your medical care. Vera looked up at Daniel, her vision blurring. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he say anything when he saw me on that platform? Because he didn't know it was you, Daniel said simply. He's been blind for 12 years, and when he saved you, you were a 13-year-old child. How could he possibly recognize a woman's voice 15 years later? He couldn't. Then how do you know it's me? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it out to her. It was a button, tarnished brass, with a distinctive pattern of crossed rifles stamped into its surface. This was on the coat you were wearing when the wagon crashed, Daniel said. Thomas kept it. He keeps everything that matters to him. When I was sorting through his things last year, helping him organize after he moved into this cabin, I found it in a wooden box, along with other things from his scouting days. He told me the story then, about the girl in Devil's Passage. Told me her name, told me how tall she'd been even at 13, told me how she'd survived something that should have killed her. Vera took the button with trembling fingers. The metal was cold and smooth, worn by time. She turned it over, and a flash of memory struck her. Her father's coat, too big for her even then, the only warm thing she'd owned, torn and bloodied in the crash. When we heard the rumors about a giant woman being sold at auction in Copper Ridge, Daniel continued, Thomas asked me to describe what I'd heard. Your height, your age, the fact that you'd come from Nebraska territory. He didn't say anything, but I saw his face change. I think part of him wondered, but he couldn't be certain. Not until he heard your voice, my voice, on the platform when you said your name. I was watching him. He went completely still, like he'd been struck. His hand went to his coat pocket, where he keeps a piece of cloth, something he's carried for years. Vera's breath caught. She remembered the small square of fabric she'd used to wrap the button, a scrap torn from her father's coat before the doctor had taken it away to burn. She'd left it behind in Prescott when her mother's cousin had collected her, too dazed and broken to remember what was hers to keep. He's known since that moment, Daniel said quietly. Known or strongly suspected, but he wouldn't say anything because he didn't want you to feel obligated, didn't want you to think he bid on you because of an old debt, or because he expected gratitude for something he did 15 years ago. Vera stared at the button in her palm, then looked toward the cabin where Thomas worked, unaware of this conversation happening above him. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile the blind Apache man who'd bought her for $1 with the young scout who'd sat with her in a frozen canyon, who'd kept her alive through 2 days of agony with nothing but his presence and his stories. The stories he told me about Coyote, she said slowly. About how a coyote was a trickster, but also a survivor. About how a coyote fell down and got back up over and over, because that's what survivors do. Apache stories, Daniel confirmed. The same ones his grandfather told him. The same ones he tells to anyone who needs reminding that falling is not the same as failing. Vera closed her fist around the button and stood. Her legs were steadier now, though her heart hammered in her chest. She looked down at the valley, at the cabin that had been prepared for her, at the life that had been offered without conditions or demands. What should I do? She asked. Daniel stood beside her. That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you what I know about my uncle. He doesn't do things halfway. When he commits to something, to someone, he commits completely. He saved your life once, and I think in some way he's been trying to save it again ever since he lost his sight and couldn't search for you anymore. Not because you need saving, but because he never got to see what became of the girl who survived, the unsurvivable. Vera turned the button over in her hand, feeling its weight, its history. Below, Scout barked at something in the meadow, and she heard Thomas's voice calling to the dog, gentle and amused. He gave me a place to stand tall, she said quietly. He built a room where I don't have to duck my head. He tells me I'm not too much. He's given me more in 3 weeks than anyone has given me in 15 years. Then maybe, Daniel said, you should tell him who you really are. Not because you owe him, but because he deserves to know that the girl he saved grew up to be exactly the kind of woman he hoped she'd become. Strong, surviving, standing. Vera nodded slowly. She slipped the button into her pocket, feeling it settle there like an anchor, and started down the hill toward the cabin. Daniel watched her go, then turned his eyes back to Devil's Passage in the distance. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the canyon in shades of amber and shadow. He thought about the strange paths people's lives took, about how a moment of kindness could echo across 15 years, about how sometimes the people we save end up saving us in return. In the cabin, Vera found Thomas sitting at the table, working on a piece of leather, punching holes for stitching. His hands moved with absolute certainty, each hole placed exactly where it needed to be. He looked up when she entered, tilting his head slightly in her direction. "You're back from the garden early," he observed. "Something wrong?" Vera crossed to the shelf where Thomas kept his treasured objects. Her hand went to the leather pouch with the beadwork, the one that had belonged to Ayasha. She lifted it down, opened it, and removed the folded cloth with the charcoal drawing, but she didn't look at the drawing of the woman on the mountain. Instead, she unfolded the cloth completely and found what she was looking for in the corner, a small piece of fabric stitched to the edge, a patch that matched the weave of her father's old coat. Her hands shook. The cloth had been hers. The pouch had been hers. She'd made the drawing herself, a 13-year-old girl's defiant imagination of what she might become, sketched in the doctor's office while her legs healed and her future stretched uncertain before her. She'd left it behind when her mother's cousin had dragged her away. Too many possessions for a girl being shipped off to servitude. Someone must have found it, kept it, and somehow it had ended up in Ayasha's hands. Or perhaps the story Thomas had told her about the Navajo woman had been partially true and partially a way to tell her about herself, without revealing too much too soon. Her mind spun, trying to untangle truth from careful fiction, trying to understand what Thomas had known and what he'd guessed and what he'd hoped. She turned to face him. He'd stopped working on the leather, his hands resting still on the table, his clouded eyes directed toward her. "You saved me in Devil's Passage," she said. Her voice didn't shake. 15 years ago. I was 13. I was trapped under a wagon, and you stayed with me for 2 days until help came." Thomas's face showed no surprise, only a deep, quiet acknowledgement. He nodded once. "You've known who I was since you heard my name on the platform." Another nod, slower this time. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas stood, his hands finding the edge of the table for orientation. "Because that was the girl you were, not the woman you became. I saved a child 15 years ago. That child doesn't owe me anything, not gratitude, not loyalty, not her presence here. But the woman standing in front of me now, the woman who survived everything the world threw at her and refused to break, owes me nothing either. I wanted you to stay because you chose to. Not because you felt indebted to a stranger who happened to be in the right canyon at the right time all those years ago." Vera set the cloth on the table and pulled the button from her pocket. She placed it beside the cloth, the brass catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. "You kept my button. You kept my drawing. You've been keeping pieces of me for 15 years. I kept pieces of hope," Thomas corrected gently. "Pieces that reminded me that sometimes people survive. That sometimes a girl trapped under a wagon in a frozen canyon grows up to be a woman standing in front of me, whole and strong, and exactly who she was always meant to be." Vera's throat closed. She looked at this man who had saved her twice now, once with his presence in a canyon, and once with $1 and an open door. She thought about the room he'd built before he knew her name, about the stories he'd told a dying girl to keep her conscious, about the way he'd refused to let her feel anything but welcomed. "I don't remember your face," she said quietly, "but I remember your voice telling me that a coyote always gets back up, that surviving is not the same as surrendering, That mountains don't apologize for touching the sky. Thomas smiled, and in that smile, she saw the young scout who'd sat with her through the coldest nights of her life. "I remember a girl who refused to die," he said, "who held on through pain that would have broken most grown men, who promised me she'd see the sunrise if I promised to stay. And I remember thinking that whatever became of her, she'd be someone remarkable, because anyone who fights that hard to live is someone the world needs." Vera crossed to him, and for the first time, she reached out and took his hand without hesitation, without reservation. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and for a moment they stood there, two people connected across 15 years of survival and loss and unexpected reunion. "I'm glad you found your way back to me," Thomas said quietly. "Even if you had to be sold for $1 to do it," Vera laughed, the sound startling her with its genuine joy. "Best dollar anyone ever spent." Outside, the sun continued its descent, painting the valley in gold and shadow. Scout barked at something in the distance, and Daniel's footsteps approached the cabin. The smell of evening carried through the open window, pine and sage and the promise of rain, and inside the cabin, a woman who'd been saved twice by the same man stood holding his hand, no longer running from her past, no longer ashamed of her size, no longer believing that she was too much for the world to hold. She was exactly enough, and she was finally, impossibly home. The days after the revelation moved differently, as though time itself had shifted into a new rhythm. Vera and Thomas circled each other with a new awareness, the weight of their shared history settling between them like morning fog in the valley, visible but not obstructing. They spoke more freely now, filling in gaps that had existed for 15 years, comparing memories of a canyon neither had ever returned to. But there were still things unsaid. Vera had told Thomas about the wagon crash, about her father's death and her mother's abandonment. But she'd offered nothing about the years between 13 and 28. Nothing about how a girl with crushed legs and no family became a woman standing on an auction platform in Copper Ridge. Thomas never asked. That was his way, to wait until someone was ready to speak their truth rather than prying it out of them. But Vera could feel the unspoken questions gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, and she knew the time was coming when she'd have to face them. It arrived on an evening in late summer when the heat had finally broken and a coolness crept down from the higher elevations. Daniel had ridden into Prescott for supplies and wouldn't return until the following day. Thomas and Vera sat on the porch as twilight settled over the valley, the last light painting the western hills in shades of purple and gold. Thomas was working on a bridle, his fingers moving over the leather with practiced precision, checking each stitch by touch alone. Vera sat beside him, ostensibly mending a tear in her dress, but her needle had been still for several minutes. Her attention focused on something far beyond the fabric in her lap. "There's a question you're trying to ask," Thomas said without looking up from his work. "I can hear it in the way you're breathing. All evening you've been starting to speak and then stopping." Vera set down her mending. "How do you do that? Know what people are thinking without seeing their faces?" "Bodies speak whether we want them to or not. Breath catches when we're nervous. Muscles tense when we're preparing to move. Silence has different textures depending on what's filling it." He paused in his stitching. "Right now, your silence is full of something you need to say, but don't know how to begin." Vera looked out across the meadow where fireflies were beginning to emerge, their lights blinking on and off, like tiny stars fallen to earth. "You told me about the Devil's Passage, about the girl you saved. But you never asked what happened to her after she left Prescott, after her legs healed and she was sent away." "No," Thomas agreed. "I assumed you'd tell me when you were ready, and if I was never ready, then that would be your choice, and I'd respect it." Vera pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a posture that made her look smaller despite her size. "My mother's cousin took me to a farm outside Omaha. He told everyone I was there to help his wife with household duties, but that was a lie. He put me to work in the fields because I was bigger than his hired men and he wouldn't have to pay me." Thomas's hand stilled on the bridle, but he didn't interrupt. I worked on that farm for 3 years. Up before dawn, in bed long after dark. They fed me enough to keep me working, but not enough to keep me healthy. By the time I was 16, I was 7 feet tall and strong enough to pull a plow without horses, and that's exactly what they made me do. Her voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion. The cousin's wife hated me, said I was unnatural, that God had cursed me, that my size was punishment for some sin my mother must have committed. She paused, watching a firefly land on the porch railing, its light pulsing slowly. When I was 17, the cousin tried to sell me to a traveling show, one of those exhibitions where they put people on display, call them curiosities and freaks, and charge admission for people to stare. The showman offered him $50 for me. Thomas's jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. I ran that night, took nothing but the clothes I was wearing and whatever food I could carry. I walked for 3 days before I found work at a lumber camp in the Dakota Territory. They didn't ask questions, didn't care where I came from. They just needed someone who could haul timber, and I was strong enough to do the work of 3 men. Vera's voice grew quieter. I spent 5 years moving from camp to camp, mine to mine, ranch to ranch. Anywhere that would take me, anywhere that cared more about my back than my face. I learned to make myself useful in ways that made people overlook how I looked. I learned to be silent, to take up as little space as possible despite my size, to never complain or ask for anything. She turned to look at Thomas directly. I learned to be invisible even though I was the most visible person in any room I entered. Thomas set the bridle aside and turned his full attention toward her voice. What brought you to Arizona? Vera's hands clenched around her knees. I was working at a cattle ranch in Colorado. The foreman's son took a liking to me, or what he thought was liking. He followed me one night when I went to the creek to wash. He said things, did things, said that someone like me should be grateful for any attention, that no one else would ever want me. Her voice hardened. I fought him off. I was stronger than he was, and I used that strength. I didn't kill him, but I hurt him badly enough that he couldn't work for weeks. His father came after me with a rifle, called me an animal, said I needed to be put down. I ran again. She pulled her dress aside, revealing a scar on her shoulder, puckered and old. He shot me as I was climbing over the fence. The bullet went through, missed anything vital, but I was bleeding badly. I made it to a mining camp, and a doctor there stitched me up and told me I needed to disappear. Said the rancher was telling everyone I'd attacked his son without provocation, that I was dangerous. Thomas's hands had curled into fists, his knuckles white. So I disappeared, Vera continued. Changed my name, or rather started using my middle name instead of my first. Moved south into New Mexico, then Arizona. Worked wherever I could, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions. But the story followed me somehow, or stories like it. People talk, rumors spread, and when you look like I do, people remember you. She stood abruptly, pacing the length of the porch. Her footsteps were heavy, shaking the boards. By the time I got to Copper Ridge, I'd been working at a freight station for 6 months. It was the longest I'd stayed anywhere since Colorado. I thought maybe I'd finally found a place where I could breathe. But then the station owner got into debt, gambling and drinking away everything he had. Vera stopped at the porch railing, gripping it so hard the wood creaked. His creditors came to collect. He didn't have the money, so he offered them to me. Said I was worth more than anything else he owned, that I could work off what he owed. They looked at me like I was livestock, evaluated me like a horse, and agreed to the terms. Thomas stood, his hand finding his walking stick. That's how you ended up on the auction platform. Yes, they hauled me to 3 different towns before Copper Ridge trying to sell me. In the first 2 towns, no one would bid. They said I was too strange, too much trouble, that I'd eat too much and cause problems. By the time we got to Copper Ridge, the creditors were desperate enough to start the bidding, at $1 just to be rid of me. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with something between fury and shame. $1. That's what 15 years of survival amounted to. That's what a life of breaking my back for people who saw me as a tool rather than a person earned me. $1. Thomas crossed to her, his walking stick tapping against the boards until he stood directly in front of her. He was so much smaller than she was, the top of his head barely reaching her shoulders, but somehow his presence filled the space between them. "No," he said firmly. $1 is what they thought you were worth. That's not the same thing as your actual worth. They valued you based on their limited ability to see. They looked at you and saw only size, only difference, only something that made them uncomfortable. But that's their failure of vision, not your failure of being. Vera's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "How can you say that? You don't even know what I look like. You're blind. You can't see how wrong I am, how much I don't fit." Thomas reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't move, his hands found her face, his palms cupping her cheeks, his fingers tracing the lines of her features with infinite gentleness. "I don't need eyes to see you," he said quietly. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, down the strong line of her jaw. "I see you every day in 100 different ways. I see you in the sound of your footsteps, confident and sure, even though the world has tried to teach you to apologize for taking up space. I see you in the way you split wood, finding satisfaction in useful strength rather than viewing your power as something to hide." His fingers traced her hairline, the shell of her ear, the curve of her neck. "I see you in the gentleness of your hands when you work in the garden, tending seedlings that are so fragile compared to you, but you never crush them. I see you in the way you laugh when Scout does something foolish, a sound that comes from deep in your chest. Unguarded and real." Vera stood frozen, barely breathing, as his hands continued their exploration of her face. No one had ever touched her like this, with reverence rather than revulsion, with curiosity rather than cruelty. "I see you in your silence, when you're thinking deeply about something, in the questions you ask about plants and animals and the way the world works. I see you in the care you take with the few possessions you own, treating them as precious because for so long you had nothing that was truly yours." His hands moved to her shoulders, spanning a width that would be impossible on most women, but he showed no surprise, no judgment. "And yes, I can feel that you're tall, that you're strong, that your body is built on a scale that makes other people uncomfortable. But that doesn't make you wrong, Vera. It makes you magnificent." The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. "I've spent my whole life being told I'm too much. Too tall, too strong, too visible, too everything. How can you stand there and tell me I'm magnificent when everyone else sees a freak?" Thomas's hands slid down her arms until he found her hands, engulfing them with his own. "Because everyone else is looking at you through the narrow lens of what they think a woman should be. They're measuring you against an arbitrary standard that was never designed to include someone like you. But that standard is meaningless. It's a box built by small minds to contain things they understand. You were never meant to fit in that box." He squeezed her hands gently. "When I touched your face just now, do you know what I felt? I felt strength in your bone structure, resilience in your skin, determination in the set of your jaw. I felt someone who has been battered by the world and refused to break. I felt like a survivor, and survivors are always magnificent, regardless of what shape their survival takes." Vera's shoulders shook with silent sobs. She'd held so much inside for so long, convinced that showing weakness would give the world another reason to diminish her. But here, on this porch, with a blind man's hands holding hers and his words wrapping around the wounded places in her heart, something inside her finally broke open. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm so tired of fighting. I'm so tired of being strong. I'm so tired of being looked at like I'm something wrong with the world instead of something in it." Thomas pulled her hands toward him, guiding her down until she was sitting on the porch step. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching, his hands still holding hers. "Then rest," he said simply. "You don't have to fight here. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. The world demanded strength from you because it was too weak to protect you. But you're not in that world anymore. You're here, in this valley, and here you can simply be." They sat in silence as full darkness settled over the valley. The fireflies multiplied, their lights creating a galaxy at ground level. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The air cooled further, carrying the scent of pine and sage and the promise of autumn to come. "I don't know how to do that," Vera said finally. "How to just be. I've been running or fighting for so long. I don't know who I am when I'm not doing either of those things." "Then we'll figure it out together," Thomas said. "You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to be willing to stay long enough to discover it." Vera looked at him. This man who had saved her twice, who couldn't see her face, but somehow saw her more clearly than anyone with perfect vision ever had. "Why me? Why did you bid on me when you could have let someone else take that burden?" Thomas turned his face toward hers, and in the darkness his clouded eyes seemed to reflect the stars. "Because you're not a burden. Because 15 years ago I watched a girl refuse to surrender to pain and death and hopelessness. I made a promise to myself that if she survived, if she made it out of that canyon, I would spend the rest of my life trying to make the world a place where survivors like her could stop fighting and start living." He reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "I couldn't find you after you left Prescott. I couldn't keep the promise I made. But then I heard your voice on that platform, and I knew I'd been given a second chance. Not to save you, because you don't need saving, but to give you what I should have given you 15 years ago, a place to stand where you don't have to make yourself smaller, where you don't have to apologize for existing, where you can finally put down the weight of other people's cruelty and just breathe." Vera's breath came out in a shudder. She leaned into him, her head dropping to his shoulder, despite the awkward angle created by their height difference. He didn't pull away, didn't stiffen. He simply sat there, solid and present, letting her rest. "I don't know if I can ever believe I'm not too much," she whispered into the darkness. "Then I'll believe it for both of us," Thomas said. "Until one day you wake up and realize you believe it too." They sat that way for a long time. Two people who had found each other across impossible circumstances, connected by survival and understanding, and the simple act of witnessing each other's pain without flinching. Inside the cabin, Scout whined softly at the door, wanting to join them. Thomas called him out, and the dog settled at their feet, his warmth adding to the comfort of the moment. Above them, stars wheeled slowly across the sky, ancient and indifferent to human suffering, but beautiful nonetheless, and for the first time in 15 years, since a 13-year-old girl had been pulled from a wrecked wagon and told she'd survived something unsurvivable, Vera Colton let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, survival could become something more than simply refusing to die. Maybe it could become permission to live. The night deepened around them, but neither moved to go inside. There would be time for sleep later, time for tomorrow, and all the days after. For now, there was only this: two people, a porch, a valley full of fireflies, and the quiet revolution of learning that being seen, truly seen, doesn't require eyes at all. It only requires someone willing to look beyond the surface and recognize the mountain standing before them. Autumn arrived in the valley with a suddenness that caught even the animals off guard. One morning the aspens were green, and seemingly overnight they transformed into pillars of gold, their leaves trembling in the crisp air. Vera had lived through the changing seasons before, but never with the leisure to appreciate them. Here she could watch the transformation happen, could mark the passage of time in falling leaves, rather than in the accumulation of scars. She'd been in the valley for nearly 4 months when the stranger arrived. Daniel spotted him first, riding up the eastern trail on a rangy sorrel gelding that looked like it had covered a serious distance. He came to the cabin where Vera was grinding corn for bread, and Thomas was sorting through dried herbs for winter storage. "Someone's coming," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge that made both of them look up. "White man alone, but he's armed. Rifle and sidearm. He's riding like he knows where he's going." Thomas stood immediately, his hand finding his walking stick. "How far?" 20 minutes, maybe less if he pushes his horse." Vera felt her stomach tighten. For 4 months, The valley had been a sanctuary, a place removed from the world and its cruelties. But she'd always known it couldn't last, that eventually something from her past would find its way here. "Stay inside," Thomas said to her. "Let me talk to him first." But Vera shook her head, even though he couldn't see the gesture. "No, I'm done hiding. Whatever this is, I'll face it." Thomas's jaw worked, but he nodded. "Then we face it together." They moved to the porch, Daniel positioning himself slightly to the side where he could reach his rifle if needed. Scout emerged from beneath the steps, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's hackles were raised, his instincts warning him about something wrong in this visitor. The rider emerged from the tree line, and Vera's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the set of his shoulders before she could make out his face. Marcus Webb, the foreman's son from Colorado, the man whose advances she'd fought off nearly 2 years ago. The last time she'd seen him, she'd left him doubled over and gasping in the dirt, while his father aimed a rifle at her back. He looked older now, harder, with a meanness carved into the lines around his mouth. His right hand rested casually on the rifle propped against his saddle, and he rode with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him whatever he chose to take from it. He reined in his horse about 30 feet from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the 3 figures on the porch before settling on Vera. A slow smile spread across his face. "Ugly and triumphant, well, he drawled. "Thought I'd never track you down, but here you are. Living comfortable while my family's been dealing with the aftermath of what you did." Thomas stepped forward slightly, his walking stick planted firmly. "State your business and then leave. You're not welcome here." Marcus's eyes flicked to Thomas, taking in the clouded eyes and the walking stick. His smile widened. "And who might you be?" "The giantess's keeper." "Didn't realize someone had put a leash on her. My name is Thomas Nakani, and this is my land. The woman you're addressing is a guest under my protection. Now state your business or ride out." Marcus dismounted, moving with deliberate slowness, making it clear he didn't consider Thomas or his words a threat. "My business is with her. She attacked my brother, left him crippled. My father wants justice, and when my father couldn't get it through proper channels, he sent me to collect it personally." Vera's hands clenched at her sides. "Your brother attacked me. I defended myself. That's not a crime. That's not how the law sees it," Marcus said. "Got a warrant right here, signed by a judge in Colorado. Says you're wanted for assault and attempted murder. Says I'm authorized to bring you back to face trial." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and waved it in the air. From this distance, Vera couldn't tell if it was genuine or a forgery, but it didn't matter. She'd learned long ago that the law rarely protected people like her. "She's not going anywhere," Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Whatever happened in Colorado is done. She's building a new life here, and you have no authority in Arizona territory." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Listen to the blind Indian, giving orders like he's got any say in the matter. You might have fooled yourself into thinking you're protecting her, but we both know what she is. She's a freak, a monster, someone who doesn't belong among decent people. My brother was doing the world a favor by trying to put her in her place." Daniel's hand moved toward his rifle, but Thomas raised his free hand slightly, a gesture for patience. Vera could feel rage building in her chest, the familiar combination of fury and helplessness that had defined so much of her life. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone. She wasn't fighting just to survive another day. She had something worth protecting now, a place that felt like home. People who saw her as human, rather than as a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited. "You need to leave," Vera said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'm not going back to Colorado. Your brother got what he deserved, and if you're smart, you'll ride out of here before you get the same." Marcus's expression darkened. His hand moved to the rifle, not quite drawing it, but making his intentions clear. Big talk for someone who's spent her whole life running. "But I've got the law on my side, and more importantly, I've got friends waiting in Copper Ridge. If I don't come back by sundown, they'll come looking for me." And they won't be as polite as I'm being. Thomas tilted his head slightly. You're lying? You rode in alone because you wanted the satisfaction of dragging her back yourself. You wanted to humiliate her one more time, but you miscalculated. You thought she'd be alone, defenseless, easy to intimidate. You didn't expect her to have people standing with her. Marcus's hand tightened on the rifle. Doesn't matter what I expected. Matters what I'm taking back with me. He pulled the rifle from its saddle holster, moving with practiced speed. But before he could level it, Vera was moving. She'd spent her entire life learning to use her size strategically, to move faster than people expected someone so large could move. She closed the distance between the porch and Marcus in 3 long strides. Her hand caught the barrel of the rifle just as he started to raise it. She twisted, using leverage rather than pure strength, and the weapon came free of his grip so suddenly he stumbled backward. She reversed the rifle in her hands, holding it like a club, and for a moment Marcus saw something in her eyes that made him realize he'd made a terrible mistake. "You want to know what your brother got?" Vera said, her voice low and dangerous. "He got a lesson in what happens when you mistake someone's patience for weakness. He thought my size made me a target. He was wrong, and so are you." She brought the rifle stock down on a nearby log with such force that the wood split and the rifle's stock cracked. She tossed the broken weapon aside and stepped closer to Marcus, who scrambled backward, his earlier confidence evaporating. "I'm not the frightened woman your brother cornered at a creek," Vera continued. "I'm not the desperate soul who stood on an auction platform. I'm someone who's finally found a reason to stop running and start standing my ground. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on your horse, and you're going to ride back to Colorado. You're going to tell your father and your brother that if they come looking for me again, they'll find more than they bargained for." Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "You can't threaten me. I'll bring the law down on this whole place. I'll make sure you and everyone protecting you pays for this." "No," Thomas said, stepping off the porch. His walking stick tapped against the ground as he moved toward Marcus. "You won't, because if you do, I'll tell them the real story. About how you tracked a woman across 2 territories, not for justice, but for revenge. About how you came to my land with a weapon and threatened a guest under my protection. About how you admitted your brother attacked her first." He stopped a few feet from Marcus, his clouded eyes somehow more intimidating than any glare. "And if the law doesn't care about that, I have friends too. Apache friends who remember what it's like to be hunted by white men who think their pride is worth more than someone else's life. Friends who know these mountains better than any lawman from Colorado ever could." Daniel stepped forward, his rifle now clearly visible in his hands. "My uncle doesn't make empty threats. You should leave while you still can." Marcus looked between the 3 of them, his hand moving toward his sidearm. But Vera was already there, her hand closing around his wrist with enough pressure to make him gasp. "Don't," she said simply. "Don't make this worse than it already is." For a long moment, they stood frozen in tableau, Vera's hand on Marcus's wrist, Thomas standing with quiet authority, Daniel with his rifle ready, and Marcus realizing that he'd walked into a situation he couldn't control through intimidation or violence. Finally, Marcus jerked his hand free and backed toward his horse. "This isn't over. My father has connections, resources. You can't hide from him forever." "We're not hiding," Vera said. "We're living. There's a difference. Now get out of this valley and don't come back." Marcus mounted his horse, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. He wheeled the animal around, then paused to look back at Vera. "You think you've won something here? You think finding a blind Indian to protect you makes you safe? You're still what you've always been. Too big, too wrong, too much for any place in this world. Eventually, everyone who looks at you will see what I see. A freak, a monster, and they'll want you gone." Vera met his eyes steadily. For years, words like those had landed like blows, reinforcing every cruel thought she'd ever had about herself. But something had changed. She'd told her story to Thomas, had felt his hands on her face, seeing her not with eyes, but with understanding. had begun to believe that maybe the problem wasn't her existence, but other people's inability to accept it. "The only monster I see," Vera said quietly, "is the one riding away. Now go, before I change my mind about letting you leave intact." Marcus spurred his horse savagely, and the animal leaped forward, galloping down the trail and disappearing into the trees. The sound of hoofbeats faded gradually, leaving behind only the wind moving through the pines and the rapid beating of Vera's heart. She stood in the yard, her hands still trembling slightly with adrenaline, staring at the broken rifle lying in the dirt. Daniel moved to check the perimeter, ensuring Marcus had truly left. Thomas remained where he stood, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the forest settling back into its normal rhythms. "He'll come back," Vera said finally. "Maybe not him, but someone like him. Someone who thinks they have the right to drag me back to face punishment for defending myself." "Probably," Thomas agreed. He turned toward her voice. "But this time you didn't run. You stood your ground. You showed him that you're not the victim he expected to find. That matters." Vera looked down at her hands, large and strong and capable of violence when necessary. For so long she'd viewed her size as a curse, something that made her a target. But today she'd used it as a shield, protecting herself and the people who'd chosen to stand with her. "I've never fought back before," she said quietly. "Not really. I've defended myself, but I've always run afterward. Always assumed that fighting back would make things worse, that it would prove I was dangerous, that it would give people a reason to fear me." Thomas crossed to her, his walking stick leading him until he stood directly in front of her. "And now I'm angry," Vera said. "I'm angry that I've spent my entire life making myself smaller because other people couldn't handle my existence. I'm angry that men like Marcus think they can hunt women across territories because their pride was wounded. I'm angry that the world treats people like me as problems to be solved rather than people deserving respect." "Good," Thomas said. "Anger has its place. It can motivate, protect, drive change. The trick is learning to channel it into something constructive rather than letting it consume you." Viscera looked toward the trail where Marcus had disappeared. "What if he does come back with the law? What if they try to force me to return to Colorado?" "Then we fight that battle when it comes," Thomas said. "But we don't fight it alone. We send word to the territorial governor, tell our side of the story, find a lawyer if necessary. The law may not be perfect, but it's not entirely on the side of men like Marcus Webb either, especially not when his so-called warrant is likely forged, and his true motives are obvious." Daniel returned from his perimeter check. "He's gone, heading south toward the main trail. If he's smart, he'll keep going. If he's not, we'll see him again soon." Thomas nodded. "Double the watch tonight. I don't think he'll try anything in the dark, but better to be cautious." As Daniel moved to take up position overlooking the trail, Thomas turned back to Vera. "How do you feel?" It was such a simple question, but it carried weight. He wasn't asking if she was hurt or scared. He was asking her to examine the emotional landscape of what had just happened, to process it, rather than simply pushing through. Vera considered the question carefully. "I feel powerful," she said finally. "Not because I was violent, but because I chose when to be violent and when to show restraint. Because I protected something that matters to me, instead of just running to survive another day. Because for the first time in my life, I had people standing with me instead of watching me fight alone." Thomas smiled. "That's not just power. That's the agency. That's deciding who you are instead of letting the world define you. Hold on to that feeling. Remember it the next time someone tries to make you feel like your existence is a problem." Vera picked up the broken rifle from where she'd thrown it and carried it to the barn. She'd use the metal parts for something useful, turn a weapon meant to control her into tools for building the life she wanted. There was a rightness to that transformation that satisfied something deep in her chest. As evening settled over the valley, Vera stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the last light fade from the sky. Thomas was right. Marcus might return, or someone like him. The world hadn't suddenly become safe just because she'd found one valley where people saw her as human. But she wasn't the same woman who'd stood on that auction platform 4 months ago, silent and resigned to whatever fate awaited her. She was someone who'd remembered how to fight, who'd found people worth fighting for, who'd discovered that power wielded in defense of dignity was power righteously used. She touched the leather pouch she now wore on a cord around her neck, the one that had once held her childhood drawing and her father's button. Inside it now, she carried something new, a small carved mountain that Thomas had made, identical to the one on his shelf, and a scrap of fabric from the dress she'd worn the day he bought her freedom for $1, symbols of where she'd been and where she was going, reminders that survival was not the same as surrender, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to disappear. The stars emerged overhead, countless and brilliant in the clear mountain air. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and Vera smiled, remembering Thomas's stories about the trickster who always got back up, who survived through cleverness and determination and an absolute refusal to let the world defeat him. She was still standing. She was still fighting, and for the first time in her life, she believed she might actually win. Winter came to the valley with a gentleness that surprised Vera. She'd known harsh winters, the kind that killed livestock and froze men in their sleep, but this was different. Snow fell in soft curtains rather than blinding storms, and the cabin that Thomas had built held warmth like a promise kept. Marcus Webb never returned. Whether he'd taken their warning to heart or simply decided Vera wasn't worth the effort remained unclear. But as weeks passed without incident, the tension that had gripped the valley began to ease. Daniel made inquiries in Copper Ridge and Prescott, listening for rumors or threats, but heard nothing. It seemed, for the moment at least, that Vera's past had released its grip on her present. She marked the passage of time not in days, but in small transformations. Her hands, once rough and calloused only from labor, now also bore the marks of gentler work, needle pricks from sewing, small cuts from learning to carve wood under Thomas's patient instruction, soil stains from preparing the garden for spring planting. Her body remained the same towering frame, but she carried it differently now, with shoulders squared rather than hunched, head high rather than bowed. It was on a crystalline January morning that Thomas made his request. They were sitting at the kitchen table, Vera mending a shirt while Thomas worked on a new bridle. Sunlight streamed through the window, turning the room golden. Scout lay by the fire, his legs twitching in some dream of chasing rabbits. "There's something I'd like to do," Thomas said, setting down his leatherworking tools. "Something that requires your permission." Vera looked up from her stitching. "What is it?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the grain of the table. "I'd like to formally adopt you into my family. Not as a child, you understand, but as a sister. In Apache tradition, family is not always defined by blood. It's defined by choice, by commitment, by who stands with you when the world tries to break you." Vera's hands stilled. "I don't understand." "Why would you want that?" "Because family is protection," Thomas said simply. "Because if you're legally recognized as my family, it becomes much harder for people like Marcus Webb to make claims against you. Because it formalizes what's already true. You belong here with us, and anyone who comes for you comes for all of us." He leaned forward slightly. "But more than that, because I want you to know that this isn't temporary. This isn't a charity with an expiration date. This is permanent. This is home for as long as you want it." Vera set down her mending, her throat tight. "I've never had a family. Not a real family. My mother sold me to relatives who worked me like an animal. My father died before he could protect me. I don't know how to be family to anyone." "Then we'll learn together," Thomas said. "Daniel has already agreed. He says he could use an aunt who can reach the high shelves without a ladder." Despite herself, Vera laughed, the sound startling Scout awake. "When would this happen?" "There's a gathering in 3 weeks, the first full moon of spring. Apache families from across the territory come together to celebrate the season's turning, to conduct ceremonies, to welcome new members into clans. I'd like you to be there. I'd like them to meet you, and I'd like to formally declare you as family in front of witnesses who will honor that declaration. Vera's hands twisted in her lap. What if they don't accept me? What if they look at me and see what everyone else sees? Thomas reached across the table, his hand finding hers with practiced accuracy. They'll see what I see, someone who survived impossible things, someone who refused to let cruelty make her cruel, someone worthy of respect and protection. And if any of them can't see that, then their vision is as clouded as my eyes, and their opinions matter just as little. Over the following weeks, preparations for the gathering consumed the household. Daniel rode out to carry messages to inform relatives and friends that Thomas Nakani would be presenting a new family member. Vera learned Apache customs from both men, practicing greetings and gestures of respect, learning the significance of certain colors and symbols. But the most important preparation was one Vera undertook alone. She went to the trunk in her room, the one Thomas had provided, and removed the dress she'd worn the day of the auction. She'd washed it multiple times since then, but it remained what it was, a garment stitched from rough fabric, shapeless and utilitarian, designed to cover rather than clothe. She laid it on her bed and studied it for a long time. Then she retrieved her sewing kit and began to work. For 2 weeks, she transformed the dress. She took it apart at the seams, added fabric she'd traded for in Copper Ridge, using money earned from selling firewood Daniel had helped her cut. She dyed portions of it using plants Thomas taught her to identify: madder root for red, indigo for blue, black walnut for rich brown. She embroidered the hem and cuffs with patterns Daniel showed her, traditional Apache designs that spoke of mountains and endurance. When she was finished, the dress was still simple, but it was no longer a costume of shame. It was a declaration. This is who I was, and this is who I've become, and both are worthy of recognition. The morning of the gathering arrived, with clear skies and air so crisp it seemed to crack when you breathed it. They left before dawn, Daniel leading a packhorse loaded with supplies, Thomas riding a gentle mare that knew the trail by heart, and Vera walking beside them, her long stride easily matching the horse's pace. The gathering site was a canyon 30 miles north, a place sacred to the Apache people, where water flowed year-round and ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls. As they approached, Vera could hear voices, laughter, the sounds of a community coming together. Her steps slowed. Thomas, sensing her hesitation, reined in his horse. "They're just people," he said gently. "Like you, like me. Some will understand immediately. Others will need time. But you don't need their approval to belong. You already belong because I say you do, and in our tradition, my word on this matter is final." Vera nodded, straightened her shoulders, and continued forward. The canyon opened before them, and Vera's breath caught. Easily 200 people filled the space, families clustered around cook fires, children running and playing, elders sitting in the shade of overhanging rocks, young men and women preparing for ceremonies. Horses grazed in a makeshift corral, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. As they entered, conversations faltered. Heads turned. Vera felt the familiar weight of stares, the assessment and judgment she'd experienced her entire life. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone. Thomas rode beside her with absolute confidence, and Daniel moved ahead to greet friends and relatives, speaking rapidly in Apache, gesturing back toward Vera with expressions that suggested pride rather than apology. An elderly woman approached, her hair white as snow, her face mapped with lines that spoke of a long life fully lived. She moved with the aid of a walking stick even more elaborate than Thomas's, carved with intricate patterns and hung with feathers. She stopped in front of Thomas's horse and spoke in Apache. Thomas dismounted and embraced her, then responded in the same language. They conversed for several minutes while Vera stood awkwardly to the side, feeling the eyes of the entire gathering upon her. Finally, Thomas turned toward Vera and switched to English. "Vera, this is my grandmother, Nasha. She's the eldest of our family and has authority to approve or deny adoption requests." The old woman's eyes, sharp despite their cloudiness with age, studied Vera from head to toe. Then she stepped forward and gestured for Vera to lower herself. Vera knelt, bringing her face closer to the elder's level. Nasha reached out and placed both hands on Vera's cheeks, much as Thomas had done months ago. She turned Vera's face side to side, her fingers tracing the bone structure, the line of jaw, the breadth of shoulders. She murmured something in Apache, Thomas translated. "She says you carry your ancestors in your bones. She says you were built by generations of survivors, each one passing down strength to the next. She says this is not accident or curse. This is legacy." Nasha released Vera's face and spoke again, longer this time, her voice carrying across the canyon. People quieted to listen. When she finished, she struck her walking stick against the ground 3 times, a sound like thunder in the silence. Thomas's voice was thick with emotion as he translated. "She says that any person who survives what you've survived and still has kindness in their heart is someone worth claiming. She says that strength without compassion is merely brutality, but strength in service of protecting oneself and others is the highest form of power." She approves the adoption. "You are now family." A cheer rose from the gathered people, starting with Daniel and spreading outward. Vera remained kneeling, tears streaming down her face. As Nasha placed a hand on her head in blessing, the ceremony itself was conducted at sunset, with Vera standing in a circle of firelight while Thomas formally declared her his sister. She was given a new name in Apache, Ziln-Cha, which Thomas explained meant mountain rising. She was wrapped in a blanket woven by Nasha's own hands, its patterns telling the story of mountains that endured through all seasons. People approached throughout the evening to welcome her, to touch the blanket in recognition, to offer small gifts, a beaded bracelet, a carved pendant, a bag of sacred corn pollen. Children stared at her with wide eyes, but without fear, and several asked if she could lift them up so they could see the canyon from her height. She obliged, raising them gently into the air, while they squealed with delight. As night deepened and fires burned bright against the darkness, an elder storyteller began to speak. He told a tale Vera had never heard, about the first days of creation, when the gods were deciding what shape to give humanity. Some gods argued for making all people the same, the storyteller said in accented English, his voice carrying easily through the canyon. Same height, same strength, same face, but the wisest god disagreed. He said that a world where everyone was identical would be a world where no one could see their own reflection in another's difference, where there was no one to remind them that being human means being varied, being unexpected, being beautifully and necessarily diverse. He gestured toward Vera. So the gods made some people tall and others short, some strong and others gentle, some loud and others quiet. And they did this not to create hierarchy, but to create community, because true community requires people who complement each other rather than compete with each other. The storyteller smiled. When you see someone who looks different from you, that is not a mistake of creation. That is creation working exactly as intended, reminding you that the world is large enough to hold all kinds of beauty, all kinds of strength, all kinds of ways of being human. The gathering lasted 3 days. Vera participated in dances she'd never learned, but followed by instinct. Shared meals with families who asked about her life with genuine interest, rather than morbid curiosity, and listened to stories that reframed everything she'd been taught about what it meant to be different. On the final evening, as they prepared to return to the valley, Nasha called Vera to her fire. The old woman sat wrapped in blankets despite the warmth, her eyes reflecting flames. "You carry shame like a stone in your pocket," Nasha said through Daniel's translation. "Heavy and constant. But shame is not yours to carry. It belongs to the people who tried to make you feel small. Their shame, their failure, their inability to see what stood before them. She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew something small and round. She held it out to Vera, a smooth river stone, polished by water and time. She was no longer Vera Colton, the woman sold for $1. She was Ziln Shah, Mountain Rising, sister to Thomas Nakani, member of a family that had chosen her as deliberately as she had chosen them. Spring arrived weeks later with an explosion of wildflowers that turned the meadow into a sea of color. Vera planted a garden 3 times the size of the previous years, her hands working the soil with confidence and joy. She built an addition to the barn, timber frame that stood 10 feet tall to accommodate her height. She carved a new sign for the entrance to the valley, burning Apache symbols into the wood alongside English letters that read, "Here stands what refuses to fall." Thomas taught her to navigate by sound and touch, closing her eyes and walking the valley trails until she could find her way as easily as he did. Daniel taught her to ride, finding a draft horse large enough to carry her comfortably, and they ranged across the territory together. Vera no longer hiding her face, but meeting people's stares with calm dignity. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Vera stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place where Daniel had once told her about Thomas's past. She held Nasha's stone in one hand and the carved wooden mountain in the other, feeling their weight, their solidity, their reminder of who she'd become. Below her, the valley spread green and alive. Thomas worked in the garden, his movements sure despite his blindness. Scout lay in a patch of sunlight. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, promising dinner and warmth and home. Vera raised her arms above her head, stretching toward the sky, claiming her space without apology. She was 7 feet tall, and she took up exactly as much room as she needed, and that was not too much. It was exactly right. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of spring and possibility. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, and Vera smiled at the sound. She had been sold for $1, had survived cruelty and rejection and the world's insistence that she was wrong. But she had also found sanctuary, had been claimed by family, had learned that survival could transform into thriving if you found the right soil in which to plant yourself. She was mountain rising. She was home. And she was finally, beautifully, completely free to be exactly who she'd always been meant to be. Magnificent, powerful and perfectly gloriously herself, the valley held her gently, the way good land holds what it has chosen to shelter. And in that holding, Vera discovered the truth that had eluded her for 28 years. She didn't need to be smaller to fit into the world. She needed to find a world brave enough to hold her at her full height. And she had. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out! And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.